They said our school was the safest place in town. I found 7 missing minutes that proved the promise was a lie, and I promised myself I would make them pay. The hallway smelled like bleach and expensive cologne at noon. My daughter's face looked steady, but her hands shook under the sleeves. I am the school nurse, so I notice small things. A scraped knee that arrives with a laugh that does not match. A bandage signed by a boy who never visits the clinic. Today, the patterns clicked, but not loudly enough. A sophomore girl came in with a form that claimed she slipped. The bruise on her elbow was straight, like a door edge, not a fall. Her breath was shallow and her eyes floated above me as if they searched for exits. I asked about dizziness, taste, and sound, but only in my head. I kept my voice even. I documented every mark, every tremor, every pause. The ceiling vent hummed with a tired rattle. A bell rang thin and far away, like a fork dropped in another room. I told myself to breathe slowly and count to 4. I wrote down the time. I circled the word unusual twice. If you were me, would you have done more right then? The inspection team would arrive next week with clipboards. The district wanted a security grant that needed clean statistics. I took my notes to the grade-level office. Smiles were polite, but the eyes were tight. They said this season was fragile and any disturbance could cost programs. That was the message, even if the words sounded different. I walked back through a corridor lined with trophy cases. Gold plates gleamed under fluorescent light, hard and cold, like teeth. My reflection looked smaller than I felt. If a system rewards silence, what happens to a child who speaks? I pressed that question against my ribs and felt it burn. I asked to review restroom logs and maintenance tickets. The answer was that access required clearance I did not have. The answer tasted like dust. I logged every denial. I logged every delay. I noted the time again. I noted the smell again, faint and wrong, woven through sanitizer like a whisper. A moving cart squealed past with trash bags tied like black balloons. One brushed my leg and left a cold smear. I thought about how fast a corridor can be wiped clean. I thought about how a story can be wiped cleaner. An unmarked USB waited in my drawer after lunch. A square of plastic, light as a coin, heavy as a secret. I closed my office door and listened to the building breathe. Pipes clicked in the walls. A locker slammed 3 rooms away. A teacher laughed, bright and brittle, then fell quiet. I opened the files and watched the hallway feeds stutter into life. The timestamp matched my notes. Students slid by in loose clusters. A custodian rolled a mop bucket that sloshed like a slow tide. Then the image froze. The clock kept counting, steady and dumb. At 12:40 the frames returned. A door stood wider than before. A paper towel skittered across the floor like a pale insect. 7 minutes were gone. Not a glitch, a cut, a decision. My throat went dry and the room seemed to lean. I tasted metal, the way fear tastes when it meets anger. Someone had access to the cameras. Someone knew what those 7 minutes contained. If you were me, would you call the police now, or wait and watch? I saved copies to a clean drive. I wrote the chain of custody on paper with block letters. I hid the USB under gauze rolls inside a sealed kit. I stepped into the corridor and felt the air change. The cologne drifted again, faint and smug, as if it owned the place. I promised myself a reckoning. Not with fists, but with proof. Not with a shout, but with a record no one could scrub. I did not know it yet, but the person who helped me next would hurt me worse. The underdog in this story would win. The price would be bloodless, and it would still feel like blood. They promised safety with posters and polished floors. I learned how a rule can hide a wound, and I kept my promise to make the truth louder than their numbers. I asked for access to the camera room, and a smile hardened. The policy book looked thick enough to stop a bullet. Pages rustled like dry leaves as a hand flipped to a clause about confidential systems. My badge meant health, not security. My request went into a log that swallowed requests and returned nothing. I wrote that down. I wrote down the time. The vents hummed a low note and my jaw matched the vibration. I walked the corridor that bled into the cafeteria. Trays clattered in a steady rain. Laughter rose and fell like waves that never reached the shore. I watched the table where the athletes sat tall and loose. Their shoulders bounced with jokes I could not hear. The cologne lived there like a flag. A teacher passed, eyes skating away from mine. A parent volunteer lifted a phone and pretended to scroll. If a town decides to see nothing, what does a mother do? I carried my notes to the office again. The answer was delay, shaped like courtesy. The answer was a future meeting with no date. I left with a paper smile and a throat full of sand. In the glass of the trophy case, my face floated over gold plates and engraved years. The numbers winked like coins at the bottom of a fountain. Wishes never saved a child. Proof did. A rattling cart followed me to the nurse station. Black bags bowed like heavy fruit. The custodian pushing the cart was young and careful. He kept his eyes kind and his voice light when he asked if I needed a bulb replaced. He moved like a person who wanted to be seen as helpful. He handed me a folded sheet and said it was an extra supply list. When the cart turned the corner, I opened the fold. It was a maintenance calendar. Camera inspections were marked with thin blue lines. Some lines stopped short. Some dates were circled twice. A name repeated on the nights the lines failed. I traced the pattern with my finger and felt heat climb my neck. I sat at my desk and let the building speak. Fluorescent lights buzzed in fitful rhythms. A locker hiccuped somewhere, metal against metal. My hands smelled like alcohol wipes and paper ink. I matched the blue marks to my notes from the clinic. The days with missing frames matched the days with forms that did not fit the bodies that carried them. 7 minutes was not a glitch. 7 minutes was a method. I asked for restroom maintenance tickets. A delayed email arrived with a single line about a door that stuck. I read it twice and felt a sting build behind my eyes. The report claimed that the lock worked as designed. I walked to the restroom myself and stood with my palm on the cold steel. The push bar sat firm against my skin. On the inside, a small latch glittered like the head of a nail. A latch that should not exist. I slid my fingernail under it and felt the bite. A door meant for escape had grown a tooth that locked from within. Who installed that? Who signed that work order? I wrote both questions in block letters and underlined them until the paper bruised. I returned to my office and pulled the USB from the sealed kit. I watched the 7 missing minutes return as an empty space that pressed against the walls. I played the feed before and after again. At 12:39, a mop bucket rolled past with water that barely moved. At 12:40, the bucket passed again, water jarred into waves. The hallway was the same, but the air had shifted. A paper towel lay in a new angle, like a hand that had changed its mind. Someone used this space as a waiting room for harm. Someone expected a door to hold. My breath came short, and I forced it out through a slow count of 4. I spoke to the grade-level office about the latch without using the word illegal. Faces arranged themselves into sympathy that did not touch the eyes. A reassurance floated toward me about ongoing upgrades. Another reassurance reminded me that outside vendors handle doors, and the paperwork takes time. My nails left small half-moons in my palms. I imagined how long 7 minutes feels when a handle will not turn. I walked away before the image locked me in place. I needed a copy of the door order, so I looked for it where no one thought I would. The school website hosted public bid awards in a folder 3 clicks deep. The file names were Gray and Patient. I found a line for security doors with a date that sat 2 months before the first missing frames. The vendor name looked familiar. It matched a name on a Booster Club flyer printed on glossy paper. The flyer featured a smiling family in Letterman jackets. The mother wore a ring with a stone that caught light like a small fire. Open loop, the vendor had ties to the team that filled the lunch table with Cologne. When the bell rang, the building shifted from order to churn. Sneakers squeaked in elastic rhythms. Backpacks thudded. The air filled with deodorant and hot plastic and cafeteria sugar. I stood against the wall and watched the stream. My daughter moved with a friend, careful and composed. Her chin lifted at a practiced angle that said she was fine. Her hand rubbed her wrist without thinking. I felt a pressure at the back of my throat, heavy and sour. I swallowed it and went back to work. I called the district office and asked for an inspection window. A polite voice promised a future calendar invite. I wrote down the time and the name. I wrote down the pitch of the voice, which sat a half step higher when I said the words, missing footage. I am a nurse. I listened for stress in breath and drum lines and pulse. The voice beat faster for 4 words and then smoothed again. I returned to the maintenance calendar that the young custodian had slipped me. I ran a finger down the margin and saw a repeated initial that matched the vendor file. The lines connected in a quiet click that landed low in my gut. I needed more than a calendar and a latch. I needed a second angle. I stood in the doorway of the auditorium and listened to the big room breathe. Curtains held a smell of dust and fabric dye. The stage wore scuff marks like constellations. I remembered emergency drills that told us to keep kids calm, count heads, and lock doors. We practiced orders that assumed doors would open again. We never practiced what to do when a door refuses mercy. A parent from the Booster Club passed me in the hall with a brochure. The paper was thick, soft at the edges. It asked for donations for security improvements. The images showed smiling students and a lock graphic that looked strong and simple. My thumb pressed the brochure until the paper bent. The pitch asked for trust while the building asked for silence. Which voice would you hear if you were me? I ended my day by making a list. Names to verify. Work orders to request. A camera that blinked blind on command. A door that could hold a child in place like a trap. A calendar that bent around certain dates. I slid the list under my keyboard and felt the plastic edge against my knuckles. I told myself the next step would cost me a friend. I told myself that justice sometimes arrives with no applause. I did not know it yet, but the helpful custodian would tie my case to the boys at the lunch table, and the knot would cut my skin before it set me free. They gathered us in a room with windows that did not open. The air smelled like carpet glue and old coffee. The chairs were set in neat rows that asked us to behave. A clock ticked with a dry, irritated click above the whiteboard. I felt the click in my throat. A stack of forms waited on a rolling cart. The heading promised partnership and discretion. The small print promised consequences if stories went outside. The paper felt heavy, like it had absorbed years of hushed meetings. The word confidential showed up so often that it stopped looking like English. I signed nothing. I wrote the time on my pad, and I noted the color of the ink that bled through the last page. Faces turned toward the front. The posture in the room asked for calm. Hands made small steeples. Eyes traveled over us like scanners. I heard words about community, about safety, about review. The words moved like polished stones. They clicked softly, they shone with use, and they hid the dirt under them. I kept my hands in my lap so my fingers would not drum. The person in charge adjusted a namatag that reflected the fluorescent light like a blade. The tones stayed warm and low. The content was cold. We were reminded that rumors can harm children. We were reminded that images can be misread. I swallowed air that tasted like dust. If I stopped breathing, the room would not notice. A form reached my row. It was an internal non-disclosure agreement. The language wrapped itself around my job, my paycheck, my insurance. It offered restraint as a virtue. It offered silence as a form of care. I looked at the signature line and pictured my daughter's hand rubbing her wrist in the hallway. I let the form pass. I left the meeting with a paper smile and a list that burned. The corridor outside felt brighter than it should. The glass in the trophies flashed like warning lights. My breath came shallow and fast, like I was running on a treadmill that refused to slow down. I counted to 4, then to 8, then back to 4. I reminded myself that rage without proof is a gift to a liar. A square envelope waited in my clinic mailbox. No name, no stamp. The paper smelled faintly of printer toner and wintergreen gum. Inside, there was a thin USB in a folded napkin. The napkin had a faint ring from a cup. I closed my door and listened to the building settle on its bones. The vent hummed a steady baritone. A locker door coughed down the hall and then fell silent. I plugged the drive into the old computer that records clinic supplies. The screen blinked awake with a washed-out blue. A single audio file sat in the root. The name was a date and a time. I turned the volume down to a whisper and pressed play. The speakers breathed static, then cleared, then carried voices softened by a table and a ceiling. I heard the scrape of a chair. I heard a pen tap and a quick 3-beat pattern. A page flipped. The shuffle of papers sounded like someone smoothing wrinkled plans. The words did not say the word erase. The words talked about clarity, about reclassification, about terms that would ease concern. A phrase about hypoglycemia slid through like a polished key. A person cleared a throat before saying, in a careful way, that the file should match our district profile. The tone used the slow cadence of a person who has chosen distance. The recording ended with a sigh that did not belong to any form of care. I sat still and felt the room tilt. I let my thumbs press deep into my palms until the heat pushed me back upright. This was not proof on paper, but it was breath on glass. I copied the file to a clean drive. I wrote the file path in block letters. I wrote the names I believed I heard and left space after each for confirmation. I slid the USB into an envelope and taped it under the drawer where the gloves sit in crisp stacks. I walked the hall that afternoon with my eyes soft so I could catch more. The custodial cart waited near the auditorium with the brakes set. The wheels faced out like they were pointing. I saw the young custodian across the lobby. His shirt was tucked sharp. His hair was trimmed to a neat fade. He carried a clipboard that looked too new. He nodded with that same careful warmth. My skin tightened at the back of my neck, like a scarf pulled one notch to snug. My daughter passed with a friend. She wore her calm like a well-tailored coat. Her gaze floated above faces and landed on exits and corners. A smell drifted after the pair of athletes who held the door. A blend of laundry softener and woodsy cologne. It hit the clinic smell that clung to my clothes. The mix made my stomach turn. My daughter's shoulders rose a notch and stayed there. Her hand moved to her wrist and rubbed an invisible patch of skin. I felt the heat rise under my breastbone. That evening I returned to the latch. The metal held the day's warmth like a hand holds heat. The small illegal catch caught the light like a fish scale. I pressed it with a pen cap and felt how little force it took to trap the door. I saw the 7 minutes fold over this latch like fabric over a hook. Who signed this into our lives? Who profited from this small cruelty? I left with those questions scratching under my ribs. At home, I washed my hands twice. The smell of sanitizer stayed stubborn, as if fear had a scent that soap could not lift. My daughter sat near a window that framed a strip of evening sky. The last light turned the glass into a pale mirror. In that reflection, I saw the line in her jaw that she got from me. I filed that small strength away for later. Healing is a ledger. I would make an entry for every quiet victory. The next morning, I followed the money. The public folder for bids led to a stack of award notices. A vendor name repeated beside the words security door package. The award date matched the month before the first missing frames. A Booster Club flyer in my desk featured a family with matching jackets. The surname matched the vendor file. The ring on the woman's hand flashed bright like a small sun. My finger traced the line of that ring in the air. I did not need a confession. I needed a chain. I asked for a copy of the door inspection report. A polite email arrived 3 hours later with a link that led to a blank page. A second email arrived 6 minutes after, which insisted that access would be granted after additional verification. The delay wore a smile and a lanyard. I printed the blank page and wrote the time across it in thick marker. A blank is still an entry. I visited the auditorium again and stood in the wings. The heavy curtains released a breath of dust and dye. Footsteps on the stage sounded hollow, like a drum with a thin skin. I imagined the meeting room and the audio file. I imagined the angle of a jaw when a person chooses numbers over children. I tasted the metal of that choice at the back of my tongue. My phone buzzed with a calendar invite from the district. It placed me in a future room with future people who would use soft words and firm hands. The subject line included the phrase, ongoing collaboration. I let the invite sit. I wrote the subject line in my notebook and added a question mark so large it crossed the margin. By mid-afternoon, the young custodian offered to help carry a box of gloves to the clinic. His kindness arrived at the exact moment I needed a witness for his alibi. He placed the box on the counter and stood in a posture that said he was ready for thanks. I watched his eyes track the drawer handles. I watched his fingers rest on the edge of the counter as if they knew the height already. My heart beat a hard 4 count behind my ribs. If I was wrong, I would lose a helpful person in a lonely fight. If I was right, I was standing 2 feet from the person who could unlock the whole chain. I returned to my desk and layered the calendar with the bid awards, the maintenance logs, and the audio file. The lines crossed in 4 places that mattered. Camera blind spots aligned with game days. Door work orders aligned with grant deadlines. The audio lined up with a sudden change in incident codes. The young custodian's initials appeared beside night shifts. On the exact dates my clinic notes flagged, the pattern clicked into place with a calm, terrifying snap. I closed my eyes and saw the corridor as a diagram. Arrows marked flows of students. Dots marked cameras. The door was a small square with a silver tooth. In that map, I drew one more mark. A path I had not taken yet. It led outside the building, outside the chain that feeds on itself, into a process that does not care for booster banners or glossy flyers. I would need to step out, and the step would cost me. I would likely lose a friend. I would likely gain a target on my back. I would take the step anyway. I tucked the clean drive into a plastic lunch container and snapped the lid shut. The click sounded louder than it should in the quiet clinic. It sounded like a promise finally given shape. I looked at the window and saw my reflection layered over the parking lot. The sky held a dull white that felt like held breath. I picked up my bag. The underdog in this story was still outnumbered. The next move would make that imbalance visible. The next move would also make it matter. The fastest way through their wall was the door they forgot to lock. I took a medical leave that my contract allowed and stepped out of their chain of command. My badge went in a drawer. My patients turned into paperwork. I filed a Title IX complaint with dates, times, and the 7 minutes that breathed like a wound. Silence tried to follow me home like a stray dog. I let it sit outside and made coffee that tasted like a burnt vow. My kitchen clock ticked with a wet click, louder than the school clock. I laid out copies of the maintenance calendar, the bid awards, and the audio file. I wrote each name in block letters and left space for what I still needed. Open loop, the person who cleaned the corridor before the police arrived. I left a message with the civil rights office and felt my ribs loosen by 1 notch. I told myself that proof inside a closed system is a candle in a jar. Proof in an external process is a flare. If you were me, would you risk your job to light it? The young custodian waited near the loading dock that afternoon. The air smelled like cut grass and hot rubber. He kept his posture careful, like a person balancing a stack of plates. He said he had an old injury and needed a lighter rotation. I heard the tremor under the request. I asked about the night the frames went dark without using the word erase. His eyes flicked once toward the security office and then back to me. The pause carried the weight I needed. He wanted out, but he wanted cover. I promised him a path I could actually deliver. I wrote the state hotline number on a sticky note and slid it across the counter with a neutral hand. I explained how whistleblower protection works in plain terms that live on state websites. I told him I could only offer truth and process, not magic. He looked at the note as if it were a thin bridge over a deep drop. He tucked it under the edge of his clipboard and nodded once, almost to himself. That evening, he slipped me a scan of a work order. The paper smelled faintly of toner and floor wax. The order listed the door latch as a custom safety feature, signed off by a vendor with the same surname as the booster flyer. The approval timestamp sat 20 hours after an email that marked a camera outage. Dates do not lie when they stand beside each other. I traced the line with my finger and felt heat bloom in my chest. I called the civil rights officer again and logged the call time. I sent the work order with a short cover note that read like a pulse. Date, place, change, consequence. I attached the maintenance calendar and drew an arrow to the nights that lined up with games. I wrote that a door meant for escape had been modified to hold. I wrote that the camera blindness was not random. My breath steadied as I typed. My hands shook after I sent it. The district tried to pull me back with a meeting invite that promised collaboration. The subject line wore a smile, but the body carried claws. I printed it and underlined the phrase, internal resolution. I filed it under paper I will bring to court if needed. I watched rain darken the parking lot and turn the painted lines into streaks. The building across the street reflected in the puddles like a patient liar. The custodian called the hotline the next morning. He told me later how his voice broke on the third sentence and then found its center. He described the order to clean the hallway before the police arrived. He gave names, dates, and the brand of the mob solution, because he remembered smells better than faces. He said he kept the original work order in a folder behind a false panel in his locker. I wrote down everything and copied the list twice. I sealed one copy in a clinic kit. I sealed the other in our home safe under a stack of birth certificates. The superintendent's office issued a memo that afternoon. The paper used phrases about community and good faith that felt like a hand on the back of my neck. It warned us about external complaints that damaged trust. It reminded us of our duty to follow chain of command. My pulse drummed in my palms. I pictured a chain around a door that should open fast and clean. I tore the memo in half and recycled it with the broken gloves and empty boxes. I met the custodian in the auditorium where the curtains held a smell of dust and dye. He looked 10 years older under the stage lights. He handed me a printout of the camera access log. A single username appeared during outages, with timestamps that wrapped around the grant deadlines like ivy. I did not celebrate, I did not cry. I breathed in through my nose and counted to 4. Then I wrote the username in ink that bled through the page. I mailed a packet to the civil rights office by certified mail. The envelope felt heavy as a small book. Inside, I placed the access log, the work order, the bid award, and a timeline that tied them to the 7 missing minutes. I kept a mirrored packet in a fireproof bag at home. I told myself that justice is not a lightning strike. It is a lever. It moves when weight is applied in the right place. Human Resources called to discuss my leave. The voice on the line was smooth, with a breath that quickened when I said Title IX. I wrote the name, the time, and the order of the questions. I ended the call with a thank you that tasted like dry toast. I looked at my hands and saw faint half-moons where my nails had pressed earlier. I pressed my palms flat on the counter until the skin warmed and my pulse slowed. The custodian sent a last message at dusk. He had placed the original work order in a sealed envelope with his name across the flap. He had given it to his union representative with instructions that it be released if he was reassigned. The sky outside the clinic window had turned the color of a bruise, healing. The parking lot lights buzzed into life, one by one, like small witnesses. I walked the hallway to the door with the silver tooth. I touched the latch and felt the chill sink into my fingertip. I imagined my daughter's breath in that space, fast and thin, counting tiles to stay present. I imagined the boys laughing as if the world had bent to please them. I did not let the image live long. I let it sharpen the point of my work and then dissolve. The Civil Rights Office acknowledged receipt 2 days later. The letter was plain and clean with no perfume of spin. The case number looked like a code to a locked room. I placed the letter on the fridge with a magnet shaped like an apple. I watched my daughter take water and stand there reading without asking. Her shoulders dropped one notch. Her jawline softened. Healing is a ledger, and I marked that entry in my head with a quiet check. The district scheduled a board meeting on safety. The agenda leaked as agendas do, and listed door compliance, camera reliability, and grant review. The superintendent's name sat beside a line item about reclassification policy. I folded the agenda into my bag and felt the edge press against my hip as I walked. A press can be a bruise or a reminder. I chose reminder. On the morning of the meeting, I wore flat shoes and carried the packet like a shield. The lobby smelled like lemon cleaner and cold air. The walls held framed photos of past teams, all teeth and light. I stood with parents who had learned to read subtext. We exchanged nods that felt like sandbags placed where the water will rise. A television in the corner showed the district logo turning slowly like a coin. When my turn came, I spoke in short pieces that fit clean in air. I described dates, smells, and metal that bit. I described a camera that blinked blind for 7 minutes at a time. I described a grant that loved low numbers more than honest ones. I did not raise my voice. I let the facts stack until they cast a shadow. I ended with a simple sentence that left no space for varnish. A door that cannot release is a trap. A school that cannot face proof is the same. The room did not applaud. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Pens paused. Eyes flicked toward the superintendent and then away. The custodian stood at the back with his hands folded over the clipboard. He looked like a person who had crossed a narrow bridge and found ground on the other side. I felt my own ground hold under my feet, solid and quiet. The underdog in this story still faced a pack, but the field had lines now. The whistle had blown. The next play would expose who had been moving the cones in the dark. I walked out into air that smelled like rain on hot concrete. The sky rumbled low like a drum behind a distant hill. I let that sound fill the space where fear had lived, and I kept walking. The boardroom smelled like fresh paint and fear. The tables gleamed like ice. The microphones waited with tiny red eyes. I stood near the aisle and felt my pulse knock in my wrists. The packet under my arm felt heavy like a small shield. The first slide promised progress. The next slide promised trust. My name did not appear, but a set of claims did. A nurse had overstepped scope. A nurse had administered a sedative without need. A nurse had created panic for personal gain. Each line clicked forward with the calm of a guillotine. A camera flashed somewhere, soft and fast, like a moth at a porch light. Heat rose behind my ears. I tasted metal and old coffee. I did not speak. I wrote the lot number of every pill in my cabinet. I wrote the chain of custody for every dose. I knew the list by muscle. I could trace it with my eyes closed. Human resources sat 2 rows ahead, shoulders squared, hands folded. The superintendent watched the room with still eyes. The smell of lemon cleaner floated under the sharp scent of toner. My breath met both smells and went thin. If you were me, would you break the quiet now, or wait for the right cut? I stepped to the podium and placed the work order on the flat wood. The latch rose from the page like a small tooth. I laid the access log beside it. The same username glowed in a tidy ladder of dates. The dates hugged grant deadlines like ivy hugs brick. I did not argue about the sedative. I placed the medication ledger down last. Lot numbers sat in a straight column. Chairs creaked. Pens paused. The superintendent's jaw moved once, a small grind, like a gear that misses a tooth. A figure at the back shifted his weight. The young custodian stood very still, like a person in a portrait. His eyes flicked to the access log and then to me. He looked both older and lighter. I understood the contradiction. Courage ages a face and frees a spine. The board president asked for calm. The words rolled like smooth stones. They scuffed nothing. I held the room with facts. 7 minutes missing on 3 dates. A latch that locks from inside. A work order signed after a camera outage. A username that enters during both. A grant that rewards low incident counts. It shifted shape. An email arrived on my phone within the hour. The subject line used the words clinical practices review. The body recommended suspension pending investigation. The words claimed neutrality. The timing screamed strategy. I printed the email and added it to my stack. A blank page can be evidence. I walked outside and let the heat press against my skin. The parking lot smelled like sun on tar. The sky carried a low hum that might have been distant traffic. I pressed my palm to my sternum and counted to 4. The count steadied the drum in my chest. A car door closed with a soft thud behind me. I did not turn. I knew who stood there by the faint trace of laundry softener. A late message from a friend who spent weekends tracing family trees as a hobby. A link sat in the message, plain and harmless. I opened it and saw faces in small squares. Names in neat lines. A branch led from the young custodian to an athlete in a school photo. Cousins. The line was not a straight pipe. It was a flexible hose. It could bend to fit any story. He was both a helper and a line into the problem. He was a bridge and a risk. I wrote the new fact in my notebook and circled it once. I would not let the twist break my case. I would let it sharpen it. I pulled payroll records that the public site kept by law. Pay codes chattered down the page in numbers and initials. Night shift differentials built a soft rhythm. A second name appeared on those nights. The second name matched the username on the access log. The pattern did not shout. The pattern breathed. It breathed in the exact spaces the school had hoped we would never measure. I pinned the printouts to a corkboard in my kitchen. The kitchen smelled like detergent and citrus peels. Lines of red thread felt dramatic and false, so I used plain pushpins. The board became a clean grid. Evidence made a weight that held the paper flat. My daughter asked nothing. Her eyes followed the grid. Her shoulders eased one notch as if the grid itself could hold her up. The district called me in for a procedural interview. The room held a long table and a glass wall that looked out on a hallway. People walked by with tight faces and quick steps. The fluorescent lights hummed on a high, thin note. I placed my packet beside it and did not touch it again. I watched their eyes, not their hands. Eyes tell you when paper has landed. They raised the sedative claim. I raised the log. They floated a vague policy. I placed the state scope of practice on the table with a finger on the line that mattered. The exchange felt like tennis played with files and pens. I kept my swing short and clean. No heat, no flare. After the interview, the superintendent issued a public note on safety upgrades. The note praised progress. The note praised community. The note did not mention the illegal latch. The note did not mention the camera username. The note tucked those points under a phrase about ongoing review. I printed the note and filed it with the grant paperwork. Money had a direction. The direction bent every sentence that Power wrote. The representative reached out with a sealed envelope that the custodian had left. Inside, there was a photocopy of a handwritten instruction. The paper listed a time, a hallway, and a line that read "Clean before responders." The signature was short and slanted. The surname matched the vendor. The ink had bled into the fibers in a way that felt very human. I felt gratitude and grief at once. I built a timeline that could live without me. I made 3 copies and placed them in 3 places. The timeline read like a metronome. The beat never changed. Date, action, result. Date, access, deletion. Date, order, latch. Date, grant, board praise. The sedative smear fell between 2 beats. It looked like what it was, a tactic. A reporter called my personal phone that week. I let the call pass. I wrote the number down and the outlet name. I saved one audio clip for this moment. The breath before the phrase about reclassification, the way the word profile dragged like a heavy net. I copied that clip and sealed it with the rest. The board announced a special session on compliance. The agenda listed camera access protocols. It listed vendor relationships. It listed grant metrics. The superintendent sat under the list like a statue under a plaque. The room filled with parents who had learned to breathe through long meetings. The air tasted like dust and peppermint. A child fussed softly. A shoe heel ticked against tile in a steady beat. I spoke when my name was called. I used short sentences that held only one idea each. I did not narrate my pain. I narrated their pattern. I held up the handwritten instruction. The room went still. I held up the access log. A vein in the superintendent's temple moved once, then held. I held up the grant terms that rewarded low numbers. The terms had more power than any speech. They were the motive written in a business voice. A parent rolled eyes in the grocery store aisle. A teacher avoided my gaze with a smile that did not reach her cheeks. I let the stings collect and point toward the same place. Resistance is a map, if you read it with care. I went home and sat with my daughter at the kitchen table. The board of pinned pages glowed in the evening light. Revenge is only a word until the weight sits on the right notch. I slid one more page under a pin. The page was a copy of the complaint number from the Civil Rights Office. A number is not a fist. A number can still move a wall. I slept for the first time in weeks without waking at 2. The night held me like a deep pool. Morning brought a brittle blue sky and air that tasted like new paper. The next step would draw blood without a blade. The next step would end careers, not lives. It would still be called revenge by people who love tidy words. I would call it what it was. I would call it enough. They said the process would take months. The process took 22 days. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and copier ink. The envelope held a decision that felt heavier than paper. The Civil Rights Office found enough to act now. Suspensions landed first, clean and fast. The access username lost building privileges by noon. The board blinked in the bright light, then called it accountability. I stood very still in my kitchen and let my shoulders drop. The hallway echoed with the hard burr of metal on metal. Each door surrendered its illegal tooth with one crisp pull. The sound carried down the corridor like a zipper through a tight seam. I felt that sound unclench, a fist inside my chest. The camera network received a full audit. A new firm mapped every blind spot like a cartographer. The map went public on a clean page that loaded fast. The 7-minute gaps no longer belonged to anyone's decisions. 60 hours became the floor, not the ceiling. The modules used real dates and real outcomes. The modules spoke in plain language, not in polished stones. Parents saw the schedule and knew these hours would not vanish. The grant committee updated its metrics. Money followed different lines now. Those lines ran through rooms with windows that opened. The athletes faced a process that did not care for trophies. 2 boys entered a court with their lawyers and mothers. 1 boy entered juvenile proceedings behind a closed door. The details stayed sealed for the children involved. I read the public statement twice and felt complicated air fill my lungs. The young custodian lost his night shift and kept his job. The union pressed for protection and carved it out of hard stone. He looked smaller when I saw him pass the lobby. Some are simply the way a person stands. Human Resources closed the claim about sedatives with one last email. The subject line used the word unfounded without adjectives. The body listed my ledger entries and signatures. It acknowledged that my scope and practice had remained sober and precise. A blank can be evidence. So can a clean line that refuses to bend. The board held a night meeting that drew a line around change. Parents filled the room with quiet that vibrated against the walls. A new policy required outside reporting for any camera loss beyond 60 seconds. A vendor disclosure sheet would now sit beside every bid award. A door inspection schedule would live on the district site. I watched the vote and felt a click inside my ribs. My daughter watched me from the end of our couch. The television showed nothing but weather and local sports. The room held the warm smell of detergent and tea. She rubbed her wrist once and then stopped noticing. Her breathing lived low and even, no longer clipped at the edges. Healing is a ledger. We made another small entry, then another. She asked to return to school with her closest friend. We designed a re-entry plan that was more than a path. It included a pass that let her step out before panic could bloom. It included a quiet room that finally earned its name. The building sounded different to me. The vents hummed at the same pitch, but the silence between hums felt safer. She looked at the doors and let the sight pass through her like light through water. A counselor handed her a thin booklet with a plain cover. They read like field guides written by the animals themselves. My daughter added 2 lines about laundry softener and the clack of a metal latch. She placed the booklet back on the table with steady hands. I joined a group that formed without fanfare. Parents and staff met in the library after hours. The room smelled like dust and glue and old stories. We built a watch list that had nothing to do with faces. We watched 4 patterns. We watched 4 gaps. We watched 4 doors that whispered wrong. We learned to notice and to write, not just to fear. I spoke about maps and windows and levers. I spoke about how a mother turned proof into policy. I did not offer names. I did not offer pain as spectacle. I offered the shape of a system changed by weight. The superintendent resigned in a letter that used the word stewardship. The board named an interim who had once taught in our building. The vendor appealed the ban and lost. The appeal read like a document written for a different town. This town had learned to read differently. This town had learned to read the margins. I planted a sugar maple in the strip of soil near the clinic window. The soil smelled rich and damp, a soft loam that took my footprints. The tree stood small and brave, leaves like small hands catching light. Students walked past and asked nothing. They watched the leaves flicker and moved on. The trunk will thicken by inches that no one notices daily. Healing moves that way. Justice sometimes does too. I placed the letter under a magnet shaped like an apple. My daughter read it and rested her head against the fridge. The kitchen filled with the low piece of a house that has survived a storm. I sat at my table and spread my folder one final time. The pages looked thinner now that their work was done. The handwritten instruction with ink bled into the fibers. The access log with the steady ladder of dates. The medication ledger that never blinked. Sometimes I think about the 7 minutes they tried to erase. I imagine them as a blank strip of film held up to light. I think about how light still passes through blanks. We filled them with sequence and names and consequence. If you were me, you might ask whether this counts as revenge. I call it an honest ending for a crooked start. Careers ended while children kept waking up to mornings. Doors open now on the first push. Cameras record and keep recording. Grants follow reports that tell the whole hard truth. That is enough for me. Enough and also a beginning. I promised a reckoning when I found the missing minutes. I kept that promise without raising my voice. I raised a lever instead. The underdog in this story stood small and held steady. At night, the maple taps the clinic window when the wind turns. The sound is light and insistent, like a reminder you choose to keep. I hear it and I count to 4 without meaning to. The count settles in my bones and tells me we built something that lasts. I turn off the light and leave the window open a little. The air smells like rain and new wood and a life that is finally ours.